Greetings, wanderers. Tonight, we drift back to the brutal winters of medieval Europe, where about a third of babies didn't live to see their first birthday. A time when maternal instinct was the only force standing between humanity's survival and the brutality of nature. It would be dark, cold, and deadly, but I promise you, not all was lost, as we are about to learn how medieval mothers found ways to keep their children safe during the harshest months of the year. If these stories bring you comfort and peace of mind, I'd appreciate a like and subscribe. And before you drift away, do leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I'm always curious how these old stories find you. Very well, it's time we settle in, dim the lights, and step into a medieval winter where we witness the lengths mothers would go to protect their offspring. The year is 1387. You are inside a humble, one-room peasant home. Outside, snow has been falling for 3 days straight. Inside, your newborn baby's breathing sounds different. Shallow, labored. You know what this means because you've heard it before, in the babies who didn't make it through their first winter. Medieval infant mortality was a grim lottery that claimed about a third of babies before their first birthday. Sometimes even more in particularly harsh years or regions. But it wasn't random chance that determined who lived and who died. Winter was the great executioner, and it had its favorite weapons. Think of it like this. Today we worry about baby-proofing our homes by covering electrical outlets and securing cabinets. Medieval mothers had to baby-proof against winter itself, an enemy that seeped through walls, contaminated water, and turned every breath into a potential threat. Pneumonia was the leading killer of medieval children during the cold months. Medieval medical texts describe it as a fever of the lungs that caused children to struggle for breath. But here's what's truly chilling about medieval winter illness. It rarely came alone. A baby might start with what we'd recognize as a simple cold. But in the drafty, smoke-filled houses of medieval Europe, that cold would settle into their tiny lungs. Their weakened immune system couldn't fight back against the secondary infections that followed. The medical texts of the time blamed something called pestilential atmosphere, but they had no idea they were actually describing the perfect storm of conditions that made winter so deadly. Medieval doctors believed that bad air itself could cause disease, and in a way, they weren't entirely wrong. The stagnant, smoke-filled air of medieval homes during winter was indeed dangerous, just not in the way they thought. Families crowded together in poorly ventilated spaces, sharing not just warmth, but every respiratory illness that passed through their village. It's like being stuck in an airplane cabin for months at a time, except the airplane is made of sticks and mud. There's a fire burning in the middle of the aisle, and nobody knows what germs are. The very strategy that kept families from freezing to death also ensured that diseases spread with ruthless efficiency. But it wasn't just the crowding. Medieval mothers faced an impossible choice every day. Burn precious fuel to keep the house warm, or save that fuel for cooking food. There wasn't enough for both. Most landlords forbade peasants from cutting trees for firewood, leaving families dependent on deadfall and sticks they could gather. As winter progressed and easily gathered wood became scarce, the cold crept deeper into homes. Many babies died not from dramatic illnesses, but from the slow, steady weakening that came from living in houses that were barely warmer than the world outside. Consider what this actually meant for a mother's milk supply. A malnourished woman struggling through a medieval winter couldn't produce the quality or quantity of breast milk her baby needed. Medieval mothers likely faced increasingly limited diets as winter stores dwindled. A nursing mother needs additional calories to produce milk, but those calories simply weren't available when the family was already surviving on whatever preserved food remained from the previous harvest. And if she was one of the unlucky ones who gave birth during the coldest months, when food stores were presumably running low, her body was fighting a losing battle on multiple fronts. The cold sapped her energy, malnutrition weakened her immune system, and the stress of keeping her family alive in harsh conditions affected her ability to care for a newborn. Then there were the diseases that thrived in medieval winter conditions. Dysentery, which they called the flux, was particularly brutal during the cold months. It caused fever, vomiting, and debilitating diarrhea that could kill a baby within days. The disease struck when families were forced to use contaminated water sources that might have been tolerable in warmer months, but became death traps when families were too desperate for water to be selective about their sources. Medieval records describe dysentery as an inflammation in the lining of the large intestine, manifesting as fever, vomiting, and debilitating diarrhea. For adults, it was miserable but often survivable. For babies, it was frequently fatal. The combination of dehydration and the inability to keep down breast milk or food created a downward spiral that medieval medicine had no way to stop. What's fascinating is how medieval chroniclers described these winter epidemics. One Italian account from the 14th century noted how gentle weather persisted, letting them catch a cold. And this poisonous cold stayed in the bodies much longer than usual. They recognized that winter illnesses behaved differently, lingering in ways that summer sicknesses didn't. The same chronicler noted that many of the persons afflicted died after a long disease. And as spring came close, many died an instant death. This observation reveals something crucial about medieval winter mortality. It wasn't always the initial illness that killed. Often, it was the accumulated weakness from months of fighting off infections in harsh conditions. A baby might survive pneumonia in December only to succumb to a minor illness in March because their tiny body had no reserves left. It's like running a marathon while carrying a heavy pack. Eventually, even small obstacles become insurmountable. Medieval families also had to contend with what they called sweating sickness, which was likely influenza. The very name tells us how they understood the disease as something that made you sweat, then left you vulnerable to the cold. Babies who survived the initial fever often died from the secondary complications, as their tiny bodies tried to regulate temperature in houses where the only heat source was a central fire pit with smoke that made breathing even more difficult. The etymology of influenza itself comes from the Italian influenza del freddo, meaning fever and cold during the cool season. Medieval people understood that certain diseases were linked to cold weather, even if they didn't understand the mechanisms behind this connection. They noticed that these winter fevers seemed to strike entire communities at once, moving from house to house like an invisible enemy. But here's what makes the medieval winter story even more heartbreaking. Snow and cold made it harder for midwives to reach laboring mothers. A baby born during a blizzard might enter the world without the skilled hands that could mean the difference between life and death. Medieval midwives carried crucial knowledge about turning breached babies, cutting umbilical cords properly, and clearing airways skills that could be life-saving. But if a midwife couldn't reach a laboring mother because of impassable roads, that knowledge was useless. Today, we complain when our food delivery is delayed by weather. Medieval families faced the prospect of life-or-death medical care being delayed by the same conditions, with no backup plan and no way to call for help. The fuel scarcity wasn't just inconvenient, it was deadly. Peasant families were mostly limited to deadfall and sticks for fuel because their landlords forbade cutting down trees. This created a terrible irony. The very forests that could have provided life-saving warmth surrounded medieval villages, but using them was illegal. Punishment for unauthorized tree cutting could include fines that would bankrupt a peasant family or even physical punishment. Babies who might have survived respiratory illnesses in a warm environment simply couldn't fight off infections when their core body temperature was constantly threatened. Medieval houses were drafty by design. The central hearth needed airflow to function. But that same airflow meant cold air was constantly circulating through the living space. The wealthy, of course, faced different challenges entirely. Noble families had access to better fuel supplies and more sophisticated heating systems. Some wealthy households had fireplaces in multiple rooms, while peasant homes had just one central hearth. But even wealth couldn't completely protect against medieval winter mortality. High infant mortality affected all social classes, not just peasants. Yet remarkably, medieval chroniclers rarely blamed the parents when babies died. Court records show that while peasant mothers were sometimes criticized for leaving infants unattended during necessary work, negligence wasn't considered a crime when families lost children. The community understood that despite every effort, winter was simply beyond human control. Medieval legal records make this clear. Negligence not a crime with which distraught parents were charged when lost a child. The understanding was that parents were doing everything possible within the constraints of medieval life. If a baby died, it was seen as God's will or natural misfortune, not parental failure. What's truly remarkable about medieval records is how they reveal the depth of parental attachment, even in the face of such devastating mortality rates. Priests wrote about counseling mothers who had gone mad with grief after losing babies to winter illnesses. These weren't people who had hardened their hearts against loss. They were parents who loved as deeply as any parent ever has, even knowing the odds were against them. Medieval church records describe priests providing comfort to devastated mothers being counseled to have courage and faith upon losing child. This language reveals the emotional reality behind the statistics. These weren't numbers in a ledger. They were beloved children whose deaths shattered their families just as surely as such losses would devastate families today. But here's what makes the medieval winter survival story so remarkable. Despite these overwhelming odds, despite the cold and the hunger and the disease, medieval mothers developed an intricate web of strategies to protect their babies. They couldn't change the fundamental conditions of medieval life, but they could and did find ways to tip the odds in their children's favor. Understanding the scope of what medieval mothers were fighting against makes their ingenuity all the more impressive. They were battling not just cold, but systemic malnutrition, legal restrictions on fuel gathering, limited medical knowledge, and social structures that offered little safety net for families in crisis. Yet somehow, they found ways to save more babies than the raw statistics might suggest possible. This sets the stage for understanding what comes next. How medieval mothers, armed with nothing but traditional knowledge and fierce determination, developed strategies to fight back against winter's deadly arsenal. Imagine being 9 months pregnant in the dead of winter and feeling your first contractions. Outside, snow has been falling for days. The nearest midwife lives 3 villages away, and the roads are impassable. Your baby is coming whether help arrives or not. This was the nightmare scenario that haunted medieval women, and it's precisely why the midwives who did make it through winter storms carried knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death. These women understood something that modern medicine has only recently rediscovered. Winter births were fundamentally different and more dangerous than births in warmer months. Medieval midwives believed that heat was essential for birth itself. They understood that cold could slow or even stop labor, leaving mothers and babies in prolonged danger. Whether this was medically accurate or not, it led them to develop elaborate strategies for keeping birthing chambers warm during the deadliest season. Today, we debate whether to set the hospital room temperature to 72 or 74 degrees. Medieval midwives had to figure out how to maintain any heat at all in drafty houses, where the only warmth came from a central fire. When snow and cold made it impossible for experienced midwives to reach laboring mothers, babies entered the world with whatever help was available, often just family members who had watched deliveries but never performed them. These emergency situations meant that basic winter survival knowledge had to be spread throughout the community. Every woman needed to know how to cut an umbilical cord without causing fatal bleeding, how to clear a newborn's airway, and most critically, how to keep a just-born baby warm enough to survive its first hours. The midwives who did manage to reach winter births faced logistical challenges. They needed to coordinate fuel supplies for heating the birthing chamber throughout what could possibly be days of labor. They had to ensure adequate supplies of heated water for cleaning and comfort. They needed warm, clean cloths ready for the baby, and backup plans for when the primary fire source failed or fuel ran out. But the real expertise of winter midwives lay in rapid assessment of newborns. They could look at a baby in those crucial first minutes and determine whether it was strong enough to survive a journey to church for baptism, or whether immediate emergency baptism was necessary. This wasn't just medical knowledge. It was spiritual triage performed in freezing conditions by women who understood that a baby's eternal soul was at stake, along with its physical survival. Emergency baptism knowledge was literally life and death information. Midwives had to memorize the exact baptismal formulas because a mistake could supposedly damn the child's soul for eternity. They carried this theological responsibility alongside their medical duties, becoming the last line of defense not just for babies' physical survival, but for their spiritual salvation. It's like being an EMT and a priest simultaneously, with no backup and no second chances. The immediate warming techniques that winter midwives developed were surprisingly sophisticated. They understood the importance of skin-to-skin contact between mother and baby, even in freezing conditions. They developed ways to pre-warm swaddling cloths near fires so that babies were wrapped in warmth rather than cold fabric. Perhaps most importantly, winter midwives served as the bridge between birth and the long struggle ahead. They could look at a newborn and assess not just its immediate condition, but its prospects for surviving the months of cold still to come. They taught new mothers the crucial first lessons in winter baby care: how to position babies for maximum warmth while nursing, how to recognize the early signs of cold-related illness, and how to make the most of limited heating resources. These women understood that their job didn't end when the baby took its first breath. A winter birth was just the beginning of a months-long battle for survival, and the knowledge they passed on to new mothers in those first hours could determine whether that battle would be won or lost. They were essentially conducting crash courses in infant winter survival, while dealing with exhausted mothers and newborns in conditions that would challenge modern emergency responders. The midwives who specialized in winter deliveries developed an almost supernatural ability to work in near darkness, by the light of fires that couldn't be too bright for fear of consuming precious fuel. They learned to identify problems by touch when visibility was limited, and to make quick decisions about resource allocation. Whether to use more fuel for heat or save it for the long recovery period ahead. What made these women truly remarkable was their understanding that winter births meant preparing for a siege. The baby was born, but now the real work began. keeping that child alive through months of cold, scarce food, and limited medical resources. The midwife's winter knowledge wasn't just about delivery. It was about setting up new families for the survival battle that lay ahead. This expertise would prove crucial, because once the midwife left, mothers were largely on their own to face the next deadly challenge: feeding a baby when food itself was scarce, and every calorie counted toward survival. Picture this scenario. It's February, your food stores from the harvest are running dangerously low. You're nursing a 3-month-old baby, and you haven't had a proper meal in days. Your breast milk is thinning, your baby is crying constantly from hunger, and you're faced with a terrifying question that no mother should ever have to ask. Do you have enough nutrition left in your own body to keep your child alive? This was the brutal reality for countless medieval mothers, and it reveals one of the most heartbreaking aspects of winter baby survival. In our modern world, we might debate whether to use organic baby formula or worry about the perfect feeding schedule. Medieval mothers were engaged in a desperate biological battle, where their own malnourished bodies were often the only thing standing between their babies and starvation. The foundation of medieval infant feeding was breastfeeding, and babies were typically nursed much longer than their modern counterparts. Skeletal evidence indicates that breastfeeding typically stopped around the child's 2nd birthday, with some women continuing for even longer, up to 3 years in some cases. This wasn't a lifestyle choice or a parenting philosophy. It was a survival strategy in a world where alternative food sources for young children were scarce and dangerous. Think about what this extended breastfeeding meant during winter months. A medieval mother might be simultaneously nursing a newborn and a toddler while her own body was surviving on whatever preserved food remained from the previous harvest. The caloric demands were staggering, and there simply weren't enough resources to meet them. It's like trying to run 2 cars on half a tank of gas. Something has to give. The church encouraged maternal breastfeeding over wet nurses when possible, partly for religious reasons, but also because they understood the practical reality. A mother's milk was often the most reliable food source available. But this religious endorsement came with a cruel irony. The very institution encouraging mothers to breastfeed offered little practical support when those mothers were too malnourished to produce adequate milk. Winter malnutrition in mothers created a vicious cycle that could doom entire families. A malnourished woman couldn't produce the quality or quantity of breast milk her baby needed. As her milk supply dwindled, the baby would become weaker and more susceptible to illness. The stress of having a sick, hungry baby would further impact the mother's health and milk production. Meanwhile, if she was nursing an older child as well, the demands on her body became literally unsustainable. Medieval people believed that breast milk could transmit both physical and psychological characteristics from mother to child. This belief actually worked in favor of maternal nursing during winter, because it meant that a mother's milk was seen as superior to any substitute. But it also created additional pressure on mothers who were already struggling. If something was wrong with the baby, the mother's milk might be blamed. The wet nurse system, which we often associate with wealthy families, had a different dynamic entirely during winter emergencies. When a mother died in childbirth or became too ill to nurse during the cold months, finding a wet nurse wasn't just about convenience. It was about immediate survival. These weren't leisurely arrangements made for social reasons. They were desperate searches for any woman with milk to spare in a community where most nursing mothers were barely managing to feed their own children. The ideal wet nurse was described as being around 30 years old, with robust health and sound moral character, with a preference for someone who resembled the mother. But during winter emergencies, families couldn't afford to be selective. Any woman with milk who was willing to take on another baby was potentially a lifesaver. The economic burden was enormous. Hiring wet nurses could push families into debt, especially during winter when resources were already stretched thin. For peasant families, wet nurses were often an impossibility. They simply didn't have the luxury of hiring full-time help. Instead, they relied on community systems where a neighbor who had recently lost a baby might nurse another family's child, or where relatives would take turns providing milk for orphaned infants. These informal arrangements were literally matters of life and death. When breast milk wasn't available, medieval families resorted to feeding methods that would horrify modern parents, but represented the best available options. Emergency feeding techniques included soaking bread in milk for the child to ingest, soaking rags in milk for babies to suckle, or pouring milk directly into an infant's mouth from animal horns. Each of these methods carried serious risks of infection, choking, or malnutrition, but they were preferable to starvation. The use of animal horns as primitive feeding bottles reveals both the ingenuity and the desperation of medieval infant care. Families would clean animal horns and use them to deliver milk or other liquids to babies who couldn't nurse. The infection risks were enormous, especially during winter when water for cleaning was scarce, and everything was more likely to be contaminated. But for families facing the choice between a risky feeding method and watching their baby starve, the decision was obvious. The weaning process during winter months was particularly treacherous. Babies were gradually introduced to what was called pap or porridge, a semi-solid mixture made from flour, bread, or cereals. But during winter, these ingredients were expensive and often in short supply. Families had to balance the nutritional needs of weaning babies against the survival needs of the entire household. Some of the emergency weaning foods seem almost impossible to believe by modern standards. Pre-chewed food by mothers was common, essentially. Mothers would chew bread, meat, or vegetables until they were soft enough for babies to swallow, then transfer the food directly to the infant's mouth. This method provided some predigestion and made tough winter foods more accessible to young children. But it also transmitted diseases and infections directly from mother to child. When desperation reached its peak, some medieval families gave babies diluted wine or even beer when other liquids weren't available. Well-diluted white wine was actually recommended in some circumstances, though the alcohol content was kept very low. In a world where water sources were often contaminated, especially during winter, these alcoholic beverages were sometimes safer than water. A grim calculus that no parent should ever have to make. The preservation and preparation of suitable baby foods during winter required enormous foresight and planning. Suitable weaning foods included bread soaked in sweetened water, thoroughly cooked rice when available, and pureed chicken for older infants. But all of these required ingredients that were precious during winter months. Sugar was a luxury item, rice was expensive and not widely available, and chickens were often needed for egg production rather than meat. 3 meals daily for weaned babies was the ideal, usually consisting of mash or porridge made from whatever grains were available. But during the worst winter months, even adults weren't eating 3 meals a day. Babies often had to make do with whatever scraps could be spared from the family's dwindling food stores. The teething process added another layer of complexity to winter feeding challenges. Medieval remedies included massaging baby gums with rabbit's brain, fat, or butter treatments that required families to have access to fresh animal products during the season when such items were most scarce. The pain of teething could make babies refuse food entirely, creating additional nutritional crises during months when every calorie was crucial. Community sharing of suitable baby foods represented one of the few bright spots in this desperate picture. Families with slightly better resources might share pre-cooked grain porridges with neighbors whose babies were struggling. Women would take turns preparing baby-appropriate foods, pooling their limited ingredients to create meals that no single family could have managed alone. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of medieval winter feeding was the impossible choices mothers faced every day. Should she eat the extra portion of bread herself to maintain her milk supply, or give it to her older children who were also hungry? Should she use precious fuel to cook baby-appropriate food, or save that fuel for heating? Should she trade away valuable items to buy milk from a neighbor, knowing that the family might need those items for other emergencies? These weren't abstract moral dilemmas. They were daily survival decisions that determined which family members lived and which ones didn't. The fact that any babies survived these conditions at all speaks to the incredible ingenuity and sacrifice of medieval mothers who found ways to keep their children fed when feeding them seemed impossible. This constant battle for adequate nutrition set the stage for the next challenge: keeping those precious calories from being lost to the cold itself. Imagine you've managed to get some milk into your baby's stomach, a victory in itself during a medieval winter. But now comes an equally crucial challenge: making sure that precious nutrition isn't immediately burned up by a tiny body struggling to stay warm in a house that's barely above freezing. Every calorie your baby consumes to fight off hypothermia is a calorie not available for growth, immune function, or simple survival. This was the daily reality for medieval families, and it required a level of strategic thinking that would challenge modern survival experts. Today, we adjust our thermostats and worry about energy bills. Medieval mothers had to create and maintain warmth for their babies using nothing but fire, ingenuity, and whatever materials they could gather or repurpose. The basic heating reality of peasant homes was both simple and brutal. Most families used a central fire pit in the middle of their one-room dwelling, with smoke exiting through a hole in the roof. This wasn't a cozy fireplace with a proper chimney. It was essentially a controlled campfire burning inside a drafty shelter. The fire provided heat, light, and cooking capability, but it also filled the house with smoke and required constant attention to prevent it from either dying out or burning the building down. Medieval houses were poorly insulated by design and necessity. Peasant homes were typically constructed of wattle and daub, essentially sticks and mud, with thatched roofs that provided some protection from rain and snow, but little insulation against cold. These structures were subject to constant cold drafts, and the central hearth that kept families alive also required airflow to function properly. It's like trying to heat a tent with a campfire while leaving the door flaps open, technically possible, but incredibly inefficient. But medieval mothers developed sophisticated strategies for creating warm microenvironments within these larger cold spaces. The key was understanding that they couldn't heat the entire house to a comfortable temperature, so they focused on heating specific areas where babies spent most of their time. This approach required careful planning and constant vigilance, but it could mean the difference between life and death for vulnerable infants. One of the most effective techniques involved heated stones from the fireplace, carefully wrapped in fabric and carried to beds for warming. This method worked like primitive hot water bottles, providing concentrated heat that could last for hours. The stones had to be heated thoroughly in the fire, but not so hot that they would burn through fabric or hurt the baby. Then they had to be wrapped in enough cloth to prevent burns while still transferring heat effectively. The logistics of the heated stone technique reveal the complexity of medieval winter baby care. Mothers had to rotate stones in and out of the fire throughout the day and night, ensuring a constant supply of warmth for their babies' sleeping areas. This meant someone had to be awake and tending the fire around the clock, an exhausting requirement that often fell on mothers who were already dealing with night feedings and their own recovery from childbirth. Body heat sharing was another crucial strategy that entire families used for survival. Families slept together on raised platforms or straw pallets, creating shared sleeping arrangements that maximized heat conservation. This wasn't about intimacy or family bonding. It was about pooling body heat to survive. Parents would position babies between them, using their own body warmth to create a heated cocoon that could sustain infant life through the coldest nights. The arrangement of sleeping areas within medieval homes was strategically planned around heat sources. Baby sleeping areas were positioned as close to the fire source as safely possible, often on raised platforms that took advantage of the fact that heat rises. But this positioning had to balance warmth against safety. Too close to the fire meant risk of burns or smoke inhalation. Too far away meant potentially fatal cold exposure. Strategic positioning extended beyond just sleeping arrangements. During the day, babies were kept in the warmest parts of the house, often near the cooking area where fires were maintained for food preparation. Mothers would move their infants throughout the day, following patches of warmth and avoiding drafts like generals positioning troops on a battlefield. The preparation of warm clothing and blankets required enormous foresight and effort. Prewarmed clothing and blankets were prepared near fires before dressing or swaddling babies. This meant that mothers had to plan outfit changes in advance, heating baby clothes by the fire before changing diapers or swaddling cloths. In a world where every piece of fabric was precious and washing was difficult, this advanced preparation could prevent babies from being exposed to cold cloth during vulnerable moments. Multiple layering before swaddling created insulation systems that could trap and maintain body heat. Medieval mothers understood the principle that multiple thin layers were more effective than single thick ones, and they developed swaddling techniques that incorporated this knowledge. Babies would be dressed in multiple layers of cloth, then swaddled in ways that created air pockets for insulation, while still allowing for necessary movement and feeding. The class differences in heating capabilities created vastly different survival prospects for babies born into different social levels. Wealthy households had fireplaces in multiple rooms, meaning that babies could be moved from room to room without leaving heated environments. Rich families could afford servants to maintain fires constantly and heat water for baby care without depleting family resources. Peasant families, by contrast, had just one central hearth and faced severe fuel limitations. Most landlords forbade peasants from cutting trees for firewood, leaving families dependent on deadfall and sticks they could gather legally. This created a terrible irony. Forests surrounded medieval villages, but using them for life-saving warmth was illegal and could result in fines that would bankrupt a family or even physical punishment. The fuel scarcity meant that peasant families faced impossible daily choices between different uses for their limited heating resources. Should they use precious wood to heat water for baby bathing, or save that fuel for overnight heating? Should they cook food thoroughly to make it safer for the family, or conserve fuel for maintaining warmth through the night? Every piece of wood burned for one purpose was a piece of wood not available for another equally critical need. Poor families developed ingenious methods for maximizing the heating value of their limited fuel supplies. They learned to bank fires carefully for overnight burning, using techniques that would maintain some heat through the night without consuming too much wood. They created windbreaks within their houses to protect babies from drafts, using hanging cloths or repositioned furniture to create more sheltered microclimates. The creation of warm microenvironments became an art form among medieval mothers. They learned to use hanging fabrics to create smaller, more heatable spaces within larger cold rooms. They positioned babies' cradles to take advantage of heat reflection from walls, or to benefit from the warmth rising from cooking fires. They developed ways to redirect and concentrate heat using simple materials like stones, metal objects, or strategically placed containers of warm water. Preheating clothes and blankets became a standard part of baby care routines, but it required careful timing and constant attention. Mothers would lay baby clothes near fires to warm them before diaper changes, ensuring that babies weren't shocked by cold fabric touching their skin. This technique was especially crucial during night feedings, when babies were most vulnerable, and when maintaining body temperature was most challenging. But perhaps the most impressive aspect of medieval baby heating was how mothers managed to maintain these complex systems while dealing with everything else required for winter survival. They had to tend fires, prepare food, care for other children, and manage household tasks, all while ensuring that their babies never lost critical body heat. It required a level of multitasking and strategic thinking that would challenge modern parents even with central heating and modern conveniences. The shared sleeping arrangements that kept babies warm also created additional challenges and risks. Multiple family members sleeping together meant that diseases spread quickly, and there was always the risk of accidentally smothering infants during the night. But these risks had to be weighed against the certainty that babies left to sleep alone in unheated spaces would likely freeze to death. The success of these heating strategies often determined not just immediate survival, but long-term health outcomes. Babies who were kept adequately warm were more likely to fight off infections, gain weight properly, and develop the reserves needed to survive other winter challenges. Those who lost too much body heat to the cold became weakened and vulnerable to every other threat that medieval winter could present. Understanding these heating challenges and solutions reveals just how much skill and dedication went into keeping medieval babies alive. Every technique required knowledge, planning, and constant vigilance. The mothers who mastered these skills were essentially running complex thermal management systems, using nothing but fire, cloth, stones, and human ingenuity. But keeping babies warm was only part of the survival equation. Those same precious bodies also needed to be kept clean and healthy, which created an entirely new set of challenges when water was scarce, and heating it consumed critical fuel supplies. Picture a medieval mother in labor during a winter storm, clutching a prayer roll wrapped around her belly while reciting charms that mix Latin with her local dialect. Around her waist, she wears a girdle embedded with amber and jasper stones, and hanging from the rafters above is a piece of parchment inscribed with the words of Saint Margaret, the patron saint who supposedly escaped from a dragon's mouth without pain. This isn't superstition layered on top of practical care. This is an integrated survival system where spiritual protection was considered just as essential as physical warmth. Today, we might view religious rituals as separate from medical care, something that provides emotional comfort but doesn't affect physical outcomes. Medieval families saw no such distinction. Spiritual protection was healthcare, and the elaborate religious practices surrounding winter births were as crucial as heating stones or preparing warm cloths. In a world where medical knowledge was limited and winter mortality was devastatingly high, faith became a technology for survival. The worship of Saint Margaret reveals how specifically medieval religious practices addressed the fears of winter childbirth. Saint Margaret's story, managing to escape from a dragon's mouth unharmed, made her the perfect patron for women hoping to emerge safely from the dangerous mouth of winter labor. Women would pray to Saint Margaret throughout their pregnancies, but especially during winter births when the risks were highest and the chances of survival lowest. The prayer rituals surrounding Saint Margaret weren't simple requests for help. They involved elaborate ceremonies that could last for hours, with specific prayers that had to be recited in exact sequence. The Passio of Saint Margaret, the written account of her martyrdom, was read aloud to laboring women during difficult deliveries. This wasn't casual reading. It was believed that hearing Saint Margaret's words provided actual protection against death in childbirth. But perhaps most fascinating were the mixed language charms that combined Latin with local dialects, with words repeated 3 times, a practice that was clearly a hangover from pre-Christian traditions. These charms represent a remarkable fusion of official church doctrine with ancient folk beliefs, creating a hybrid spiritual system that medieval families believed could literally save lives during winter emergencies. The triple repetition wasn't arbitrary. In pre-Christian European traditions, the number 3 held magical significance, and this belief persisted even as Christianity spread throughout the continent. So a medieval mother might recite Sancta Margareta or a pro nobis 3 times in Latin, then repeat a similar plea in her own language 3 more times, creating layers of spiritual protection that drew from both Christian and ancient sources. Prayer rolls and religious manuscripts served as physical talismans during winter births. These weren't just texts to be read, they were objects believed to possess protective power through their very presence. Wealthy families would commission elaborate prayer rolls specifically for difficult births, often spending enormous sums on beautifully illuminated manuscripts that would be brought into the birthing chamber like sacred shields against death. Religious institutions recognized the importance of these practices and developed sophisticated lending systems. Churches and monasteries kept special girdles that could be borrowed by pregnant women during their most vulnerable periods. These weren't simple belts. They were complex religious artifacts embedded with sacred symbols, blessed by priests, and often containing written prayers or fragments of holy relics. The girdle system reveals how seriously medieval religious institutions took the spiritual aspect of winter survival. These items were carefully maintained and recorded, with detailed logs of which families had borrowed them and for what purposes. The girdles were considered so valuable and effective that waiting lists developed, and families would plan their borrowing around expected birth dates. Gemstone girdles represented the intersection of religious belief and what we might call primitive medical technology. Mothers in labor would wear girdles embedded with amber, sard, or jasper, with the stones first being rubbed against their thighs to ease pain. The choice of stones wasn't random. Each was believed to have specific properties that could assist with childbirth and protect against winter-related complications. The ritual surrounding these stones was elaborate and specific. Before being placed in girdles, the stones had to be blessed according to precise formulas. Hildegard of Bingen, the famous German abbess, wrote specific words that were supposed to be spoken while rubbing the stones. Just as you, stone, by the order of God, shone on the first angel, so you, child, come forth a shining person. This wasn't casual superstition. It was a carefully developed spiritual technology with specific procedures and expected outcomes. Amulets and religious objects were strategically placed during labor to create protective zones around mothers and babies. Amber could be placed on the mother's stomach, Holy relics were positioned within reach of laboring women, and religious texts were arranged around the birthing area. The goal was to surround the birth with as many sources of spiritual protection as possible, creating a sacred space that could resist the forces of winter death. The religious chants and prayers used during labor weren't background music. They were active interventions believed to have direct effects on the birthing process. Specific prayers were thought to ease pain, speed delivery, and protect both mother and child from the dangers of winter birth. These chants often went on for hours, with women taking turns maintaining the continuous stream of protective words. Holy relics held a special place in winter birth protection. Families would compete to borrow actual physical remains of saints or objects that had touched holy figures, believing that these items carried protective power that could overcome the natural dangers of winter childbirth. The most precious relics were reserved for the most dangerous situations, typically winter births where multiple risk factors suggested low survival chances. But religious protection didn't end with successful delivery. The post-birth ceremonies were equally elaborate and considered just as crucial for winter survival. Immediate baptism was urgent because babies' souls were believed to be in jeopardy if they died unbaptized. And winter newborns had such uncertain survival prospects that spiritual salvation couldn't be delayed. Emergency baptism procedures reveal how seriously medieval communities took the spiritual aspects of infant survival. Any competent person could perform baptism in emergencies, but midwives specifically memorized the correct formulas because they were most likely to be present when babies were born in life-threatening conditions. The words had to be exactly right. A mistake in the baptismal formula could supposedly doom the child's soul for eternity. The urgency of winter baptism created complex logistical challenges. Should the baby be taken to church immediately after birth, risking death from cold exposure during the journey? Or should emergency baptism be performed at home, potentially invalidating the ceremony if the baby survived? These decisions required careful assessment of the infant's condition and survival prospects, with spiritual and physical factors weighed against each other. Godparent selection during winter births served practical as well as spiritual purposes. Godparents weren't supposed to be related to their godchild through blood or marriage, which meant that they represented an extended support network beyond the immediate family. During winter emergencies, when nuclear families were struggling to survive, godparents could provide crucial backup resources and assistance. The churching ceremony, performed weeks after birth, marked the end of the mother's confinement period and officially welcomed both mother and child back into the community. But during winter, this ceremony also served as a celebration of survival against impossible odds. A successful churching meant that both mother and baby had survived the most dangerous period, and the community could begin to invest emotionally in the new child's future. Community integration through baptism created lifelong bonds that extended far beyond the immediate family. When a baby survived winter birth and received proper baptism, they were welcomed into a network of spiritual relationships that could provide support throughout their life. These connections often proved crucial during future winters, when the same families that had celebrated a child's birth might be called upon to help ensure their continued survival. The religious protection systems developed around winter births weren't separate from practical care. They were integrated with every aspect of the survival process. Prayers were recited while heating stones. Religious objects were positioned while preparing warm cloths, and spiritual rituals were performed alongside physical interventions. In the medieval mind, protecting a baby's soul and protecting their body were parts of the same essential task. But even the most elaborate religious protections couldn't address every aspect of winter baby survival. While spiritual rituals provided hope and community support, mothers still needed practical knowledge about herbal medicines and natural remedies that could supplement prayer with tangible healing interventions. Envision a medieval monastery garden in December, where monks walk among rows of carefully tended herbs that could mean the difference between life and death for winter babies throughout their region. Under layers of protective coverings, sage and chamomile wait to be harvested. In the monastery's storage rooms, bundles of dried feverfew and willow bark hang from the rafters, preserved since autumn and maintaining their healing potency through the dark months ahead. This scene represents one of the most sophisticated aspects of medieval winter baby survival. A network of herbal knowledge and plant-based medicine that operated parallel to religious rituals and practical care techniques. Today, we might think of herbal medicine as alternative healthcare, something that supplements conventional treatment. For medieval families, herbal remedies were conventional treatment, often the only medical intervention available when babies fell ill during the deadliest season. The monastery gardens weren't just sources of food for religious communities. They were the research and development centers of medieval medicine, where monks cultivated and experimented with medicinal plants specifically chosen for their ability to treat winter ailments. These men understood that their plant knowledge could serve their surrounding communities, and they took this responsibility seriously, developing preservation techniques that could maintain herbal potency throughout the cold months. Monks had discovered that herbs could be preserved through drying for up to a year without losing their therapeutic properties. This was crucial knowledge for winter baby survival, because it meant that healing plants gathered during summer and autumn could remain effective throughout the periods when fresh plant material was impossible to find. The drying process itself became a sophisticated technology, with different herbs requiring different preservation methods to maintain their healing compounds. The monastery medicine networks created an exchange system that spread herbal knowledge far beyond individual communities. Monks would share information about useful but distant herbs, copying and distributing texts that described new healing plants and preparation methods. This meant that a monastery in northern France might learn about Mediterranean herbs that could help with infant winter illnesses, and develop trade relationships to obtain these plants for their local communities. But the practical application of herbal medicine for winter babies required knowledge that went far beyond simply knowing which plants were helpful. Medieval mothers and healers had to understand dosages appropriate for infants, preparation methods that would make herbs safe for tiny digestive systems, and delivery techniques that could get medicine into sick babies who might be too weak to swallow normally. Feverfew and willow were among the most important herbs for treating winter infant illnesses. These plants were used both to break existing fevers and to prevent fevers from developing in babies who were showing early signs of illness. But using these herbs safely with infants required sophisticated understanding of preparation methods. Too strong a preparation could be dangerous for tiny bodies. Too weak would be ineffective against serious illness. The fever-fighting properties of these herbs were particularly crucial during winter months, when pneumonia and influenza could kill babies within days. Medieval healers understood that bringing down dangerous fevers quickly could save infant lives, and they developed specific protocols for using willow bark and feverfew with different age groups of babies. The timing of treatment was critical. Too early, and the herbs might not be needed. Too late, and they might not be effective. Sage and peppermint served different but equally important functions as digestive aids, especially valuable for nursing mothers whose limited winter diets could affect their milk quality and their baby's ability to process nutrients. These herbs could help mothers maintain better digestion during months when food variety was severely limited, which in turn could improve the nutritional value of their breast milk. The digestive benefits extended to babies as well. Weak preparations of these herbs could be given to babies who were struggling with stomach problems, or who seemed unable to keep down milk during illness. The preparation had to be extremely careful, diluted to strengths that wouldn't overwhelm infant systems while still providing therapeutic benefits. Hyssop represented one of the more complex herbal preparations used for winter infant care. This herb was drunk in oil, wine, or syrup, specifically to warm away cold catarrhs and chest phlegm. The choice of liquid carrier wasn't arbitrary. Each provided different benefits and absorption rates. Oil-based preparations lasted longer in the system, wine-based preparations worked more quickly, and syrup-based preparations were easier for sick babies to swallow. The treatment of chest congestion and respiratory problems was particularly important during winter months, when pneumonia was the leading killer of infants. Hyssop preparations could help babies cough up dangerous mucus that might otherwise block their airways or provide breeding grounds for infection. But timing and dosage were critical. Too much could cause vomiting in babies who were already weakened by illness. Chamomile flowers created some of the most versatile herbal medicines for winter baby care. The sedative properties could help fussy babies sleep better during illness, while the digestive benefits helped combat the flatulence and stomach problems that often accompanied winter feeding difficulties. Chamomile preparations were generally safer for infants than many other herbs, making them a go-to treatment for multiple problems. The sedative effects of chamomile were particularly valuable during winter nights when babies were struggling with illness or discomfort. Helping sick babies get adequate rest could be crucial for recovery, especially when families were dealing with multiple health problems simultaneously. But even chamomile required careful preparation to avoid oversedating babies whose systems were already compromised by illness or malnutrition. Comfrey, known as boneset, was grown specifically for its ability to heal wounds and help set broken bones. While broken bones might seem irrelevant to infant care, this herb was actually important for treating the injuries that could occur when families were struggling to care for babies in difficult winter conditions. Falls, burns from heating methods, or other accidents were more common when families were stressed and working with dangerous heating and lighting systems. The wound-healing properties of comfrey were also valuable for treating the skin problems that could develop when babies were bundled in layers of clothing for warmth. Prolonged contact with damp or dirty cloth could cause rashes and sores that, if left untreated, could become serious infections. Comfrey preparations could help these wounds heal quickly before they became life-threatening problems. The preparation of herbal medicines became more sophisticated after 1351, when alcohol distillation techniques reached Europe. Herbal medicines became significantly more effective when made with alcohol rather than water or oil, because alcohol could extract and preserve more of the active compounds from healing plants. This advancement was particularly important for winter medicine, because alcohol-based preparations lasted longer and remained potent throughout the cold months. But alcohol-enhanced herbal preparations also required more sophisticated knowledge about dosages and safety, especially when treating infants. The alcohol content had to be calculated carefully to provide therapeutic benefits without poisoning tiny bodies that couldn't process alcohol effectively. This led to the development of preparation techniques that could capture the benefits of alcohol extraction while removing most of the alcohol before administration. Some medicinal herbs could be harvested throughout the year, providing crucial flexibility for winter baby care. Willow bark could be gathered even during winter months, and garlic remained available from storage throughout the cold season. These year-round herbs became the backbone of winter infant medicine, reliable sources of healing compounds when other plants were unavailable. The accessibility of these winter herbs meant that even families without extensive herb gardens or connections to monastery networks could still provide some level of herbal care for their babies. A family with access to willow trees and stored garlic could treat fevers and infections, even if they couldn't afford more exotic or carefully prepared herbal medicines. Oil-based herbal preparations represented another sophisticated aspect of medieval infant medicine. Sweet-smelling herb oils using rose, lavender, and sage mixed with olive oil were used for treating joint pains and muscle problems that could develop when babies were confined to cramped, cold spaces for extended periods. These oils could also be used for massage, which provided both therapeutic benefits and crucial human contact for babies who were isolated due to illness. The massage applications of herbal oils were particularly important for babies who were recovering from serious illness and needed help rebuilding muscle strength and flexibility. Extended periods of illness could leave babies weakened and stiff, and herbal massage oils provided a way to combine physical therapy with medicine, helping babies regain health more quickly and completely. Emergency herbal remedies could be prepared quickly for sudden infant illnesses, but this required families to maintain stocks of dried herbs and know rapid preparation techniques. When a baby developed a dangerous fever in the middle of a winter night, there wasn't time to send someone to a monastery garden or search for fresh plants. Families needed herbs on hand and the knowledge to prepare them quickly and effectively. The speed of preparation was often crucial for infant survival. A baby's condition could deteriorate rapidly during winter illness, and treatments that might work if applied quickly could be useless if delayed by hours or days. This meant that medieval mothers had to become skilled at rapid diagnosis and immediate herbal intervention, making life-or-death medical decisions with limited information and no backup support. But herbal medicine was only one component of comprehensive winter baby care. Even the most effective herbal treatments couldn't help babies who weren't clean and properly maintained, which created another set of challenges when water was scarce, and heating it consumed precious fuel. Put yourself in the position of a medieval mother facing what should be a simple task, giving your baby a bath. It's January, your fuel supplies are running dangerously low, and you haven't been able to heat enough water for a proper bath in 3 days. Your baby's skin is developing a rash from prolonged contact with damp, swaddling cloths. But heating enough water for bathing would consume wood that you need for cooking the family's only hot meal of the day. This impossible choice between cleanliness and survival reveals one of the most heartbreaking aspects of medieval winter baby care. Today, we turn a handle and get hot water instantly, then worry about whether we're using the right soap or maintaining the perfect bath temperature. Medieval mothers had to weigh every drop of heated water against competing survival needs, knowing that the choice between a clean baby and a warm house could literally determine who lived and who died. The recommended frequency for bathing medieval babies was actually quite ambitious: 2 to 3 times daily with hand-warm water. This wasn't a casual suggestion from overly fastidious caregivers. Medieval medical knowledge understood that clean babies were healthier babies, and that regular bathing could prevent the skin infections and illnesses that thrived in the dirty, cramped conditions of winter survival. But implementing this recommendation during the coldest months required logistical planning that would challenge a modern military operation. Winter bathing had to be done near the fireplace for warmth and safety, which meant that every bath became a complex choreography of fuel management, water heating, and temperature control. The bathing area had to be warm enough to prevent the baby from developing hypothermia when removed from the water, but not so close to the fire that sparks or smoke posed additional dangers. Finding this balance required constant attention and careful positioning of both baby and heating equipment. The process of heating bath water reveals just how resource-intensive proper baby hygiene could be during winter months. All water had to be heated manually over fires, which meant that preparing for a single bath could consume significant amounts of precious firewood. For families already struggling with fuel scarcity, the choice between heating water for baby bathing and heating water for cooking or drinking became a daily moral crisis with no good answers. Heating bath water multiple times daily, as recommended by medieval medical advice, was simply impossible for most peasant families during winter. The fuel requirements alone would have consumed their entire wood supply within days, leaving them without heat for cooking, warmth, or light. This created a gap between medical recommendations and practical reality that mothers had to navigate using creativity, compromise, and sometimes desperate improvisation. Temperature control during winter bathing required skills that combined medical knowledge with practical engineering. Medieval instructions warned against letting the baby's skin become red or overheated, but also emphasized the importance of keeping the water warm enough to provide therapeutic benefits. Without thermometers or reliable heat sources, mothers had to judge water temperature by touch and adjust heating throughout the bathing process. The physical therapy aspects of medieval baby bathing were actually quite sophisticated. Children were encouraged to move in the bath water to build muscles and stretch their limbs, and caregivers would gently move baby arms and legs while they were in the warm water. This wasn't just about cleanliness. It was about maintaining physical development during months when babies were often confined to small, cramped spaces for warmth and protection. Care was taken to prevent water from getting into babies' ears during baths, showing an understanding of the connection between ear infections and cold, wet conditions. This attention to detail reveals how seriously medieval caregivers took the medical aspects of bathing, understanding that improper bathing techniques could create new health problems even while solving hygiene issues. Post-bath procedures were just as important as the bathing itself. Immediate wrapping in soft, pre-warmed cloths was essential to prevent dangerous temperature drops that could shock infant systems already stressed by cold conditions. This meant that bath preparation had to include heating cloths and blankets near the fire, adding another layer of complexity to an already challenging process. But the reality for most families was that full bathing according to medical recommendations was simply impossible during the worst winter months. Instead, they developed alternative hygiene strategies that could maintain baby cleanliness without consuming unsustainable amounts of fuel. These adaptations reveal the ingenuity of medieval mothers who refused to let impossible circumstances prevent them from caring for their babies. Spot cleaning with warmed cloths became the primary hygiene method when full baths were impossible. Mothers would heat small amounts of water and use warm, damp cloths to clean the most important areas of their babies' bodies, focusing on preventing infections and rashes while conserving fuel and water. This technique required careful prioritization, cleaning the areas most likely to develop problems while leaving less critical areas for when resources became available. Strategic timing became crucial for making the most of limited bathing opportunities. Families would coordinate bathing with other activities that required heated water, such as cooking or laundry, to maximize the utility of every fire and every heated pot of water. A single heating session might provide water for cooking dinner, washing clothes, and giving the baby a quick bath, but this required careful planning and precise timing. Alternative cleaning methods using warmed oils could replace water when fuel shortages made heating water impossible. Families would warm small amounts of oil near fires and use these to clean and moisturize baby skin while providing some of the benefits of traditional bathing. Oil-based cleaning was particularly useful for treating the rashes and skin problems that could develop when regular bathing wasn't possible. Weather barriers played a major role in determining when and how babies could be bathed. Extreme cold made any bathing dangerous because wet skin lost heat so rapidly that babies could develop hypothermia even in heated rooms. Mothers had to learn to assess weather conditions and baby health status to determine when bathing was safe and when it was too risky to attempt. The class differences in bathing capabilities were stark and often meant the difference between life and death for winter babies. Wealthy families could afford servants whose primary job was heating water and maintaining fires, meaning that their babies could receive regular baths even during the coldest months. They had access to multiple fire sources, unlimited fuel supplies, and dedicated staff who could focus on baby care without worrying about competing survival needs. Peasant families, by contrast, had to do everything themselves while managing all the other requirements of winter survival. A peasant mother might be simultaneously tending a sick baby, preparing food for the family, maintaining the fire, and trying to complete household tasks necessary for survival. Adding regular baby bathing to this workload was often simply impossible, no matter how much she wanted to provide proper care for her child. The fuel limitations that affected peasant families weren't just about comfort or convenience. They were about survival priorities that pitted baby hygiene against family nutrition, warmth against cleanliness, and immediate needs against long-term health. A mother who used too much fuel for baby bathing might leave her family without adequate heat for cooking food or staying warm through the night. But perhaps most remarkable about medieval winter bathing practices was how mothers managed to maintain any level of baby hygiene at all under such challenging conditions. They developed rotation systems for heating water, timing strategies that maximized resource efficiency, and alternative cleaning methods that could provide care when traditional bathing was impossible. Their creativity and determination meant that even under the worst circumstances, babies received some level of hygiene care. The integration of bathing with medical care shows how sophisticated medieval understanding of infant health could be. Bathing wasn't just about cleanliness. It was about preventing infections, maintaining skin health, promoting physical development, and providing comfort during illness. Mothers understood that clean babies were healthier babies, and they found ways to provide this care even when the resources seemed insufficient. But even the cleanest baby needed proper clothing and protection from the elements, which created yet another set of challenges when fabric was expensive. Layering was essential for warmth, and every piece of clothing had to serve multiple survival functions. Think about what it means to dress a baby when every piece of fabric in your household represents weeks of labor. When wool is so expensive that most families own only 1 or 2 garments made from it, and when the difference between proper layering and inadequate clothing could determine whether your child survives the winter. This was the reality for medieval mothers, who had to master the art of baby clothing using materials that were precious, limited, and often completely unsuitable for infant skin. The foundation of medieval infant clothing was based on a belief that babies were soft as wax and needed proper positioning to develop correctly. This wasn't just about comfort or appearance. It was about ensuring that children grew with straight limbs and proper bone development. Swaddling was seen as a medical intervention that could prevent lifelong deformities, making it as essential as nutrition or warmth for infant well-being. But swaddling during winter required balancing multiple competing needs that modern parents never have to consider. The baby needed to be warm enough to survive cold conditions, but not so tightly wrapped that circulation was cut off. They needed protection from drafts and cold air, but also needed to be accessible for feeding and diaper changes. Most critically, they needed to be dressed in layers that could be adjusted quickly as conditions changed throughout the day and night. Medieval swaddling wasn't the continuous restraint system that many people imagine. Babies were not swaddled continuously around the clock. They were regularly changed, released to move around freely, and given opportunities to crawl and exercise. The swaddling served specific purposes during specific times, particularly during sleep, and when babies needed extra warmth during the coldest parts of winter days and nights. Winter modifications to swaddling techniques included extra layers and warmer wrapping materials. But these additions had to be carefully managed to avoid overheating or restricting movement too severely. Mothers had to develop an intuitive understanding of how many layers were appropriate for different temperature conditions, and how to adjust wrapping throughout the day as indoor temperatures fluctuated with fire management and outdoor weather changes. The cultural variations in swaddling practices reveal how differently various communities approached winter baby survival. Irish children were never swaddled according to medieval records, yet they seemed to grow strong and healthy without this intervention. This observation suggests that swaddling was a technique rather than a requirement, and that different communities developed different strategies for achieving the same goal of healthy infant development during harsh conditions. The choice of materials for baby clothing created impossible dilemmas for families with limited resources. Wool was the favored fabric for warmth, but it was extremely itchy and uncomfortable against infant skin. This meant that babies needed linen garments underneath wool layers, but linen was expensive and difficult to maintain. Families had to balance the warmth benefits of wool against the comfort requirements of delicate baby skin. The itchiness of wool created practical problems beyond mere discomfort. Babies who were constantly irritated by scratchy fabric would cry more, sleep less, and potentially develop skin problems that could become serious infections. But families who couldn't afford sufficient linen undergarments had little choice but to use wool directly against baby skin, creating a situation where the cure for cold exposure created new health problems. Class differences in baby clothing were stark and often determined survival outcomes. Noble families had access to expensive furs that provided superior warmth without the itchiness problems of wool. They could afford multiple sets of linen undergarments, meaning that babies could be kept clean and comfortable even during extended cold periods. Most importantly, they could afford specialized baby clothing designed specifically for infant needs rather than adapting adult garments. Peasant families faced severe restrictions on the types of materials they could legally use for baby clothing. Sumptuary laws restricted certain furs and luxury fabrics to upper social classes, meaning that even families who could somehow afford these materials were legally prohibited from using them. These laws created situations where life-saving clothing materials were available, but forbidden, forcing families to choose between legal compliance and infant survival. The furs that peasant families could use came from small game animals that their lords allowed them to catch, typically rabbits, squirrels, and other creatures that weren't considered valuable enough to be reserved for noble hunting. These small pelts had to be carefully processed and sewn together to create garments large enough for baby use, requiring skills in both hunting and textile work that not all families possessed. Community sharing and lending of warm baby clothes became essential survival strategies during the harshest winter months. Families would pass clothing between households as babies outgrew garments, or when families faced particular emergencies. These informal lending networks ensured that warm baby clothes stayed in circulation throughout communities rather than sitting unused, while babies in other families suffered from inadequate clothing. The hand-me-down systems that developed around baby clothing reveal both the community spirit and the resource scarcity that characterized medieval winter survival. A single warm baby garment might be used by multiple families throughout a winter season, passed from household to household as babies grew or circumstances changed. These sharing systems required community coordination and trust, but they could mean the difference between survival and death for babies whose families couldn't afford adequate clothing. Multiple layering systems were designed to be adjustable as babies grew rapidly during their first years of life. Medieval mothers had to create clothing arrangements that could accommodate dramatic size changes without requiring complete replacement of expensive garments. This led to innovative design approaches that used ties, wraps, and adjustable fasteners, rather than fitted clothing that would quickly become unusable. Easy access designs were crucial for maintaining baby care routines while keeping infants warm. Clothing had to allow for feeding and diaper changes without completely undressing babies in cold conditions. This requirement led to the development of wrap-style garments and strategic openings that provided necessary access while maintaining thermal protection. The design challenge was considerable, creating warmth without creating inconvenience that could endanger baby health. Emergency clothing creation became a necessary skill when unexpected winter births occurred, or when babies outgrew their garments during particularly long cold seasons. Mothers had to know how to quickly adapt household materials into usable baby clothing, using blankets, adult garments, or whatever fabric was available to create emergency warmth solutions. These improvisations often had to be done quickly during crisis situations when baby survival was immediately threatened. The integration of protective amulets and religious symbols into baby clothing design shows how medieval mothers combined practical and spiritual protection strategies. Religious symbols could be sewn into garments or attached to clothing in ways that provided spiritual protection, while serving practical functions like fasteners or decorative elements. This integration meant that every piece of baby clothing served multiple survival functions simultaneously. But even the most sophisticated clothing and swaddling systems couldn't address all the challenges of winter baby survival. Individual families, no matter how skilled or dedicated, simply couldn't provide everything their babies needed to survive the harsh conditions. This reality led to the development of community support networks that became just as essential as any material preparation or technical skill. The balance between warmth, protection, and healthy infant development required constant attention and adjustment throughout the winter months. Mothers had to monitor their babies continuously for signs of overheating, circulation problems, or skin irritation, while maintaining adequate protection against cold exposure. This level of vigilance was exhausting, but it was necessary for navigating the complex trade-offs involved in winter baby clothing. Understanding the clothing and swaddling challenges reveals how every aspect of medieval winter baby care required specialized knowledge, careful planning, and constant adaptation to changing conditions. The mothers who mastered these skills were essentially managing complex systems that balanced thermal regulation, medical care, resource conservation, and infant development, using materials and techniques that were limited, expensive, and often inadequate for the challenges they faced. The success of these clothing strategies often determined whether babies survived not just immediate cold exposure, but the accumulated stress of months of harsh conditions. Properly dressed, babies were more likely to sleep well, resist infections, and maintain the energy needed for growth and development during the period when their survival was most uncertain. What would it feel like to realize that your 3-month-old baby is developing pneumonia? Your own milk supply is failing because you haven't eaten a proper meal in days, and your husband is too sick with fever to gather firewood, all while snow continues to fall outside your one-room house. In our modern world, this scenario would trigger emergency services, hospital visits, and social support systems designed to prevent family crises from becoming family tragedies. In medieval Europe, this scenario triggered something equally powerful but entirely different. Community networks that could mobilize resources, knowledge, and support with a speed and efficiency that was remarkably effective for their time. These networks weren't formal organizations with official procedures and government backing. They were intricate webs of relationships, obligations, and mutual support that had evolved over generations to address the reality that no individual family could survive winter baby emergencies alone. Today, we call Child Protective Services when we're worried about a family's ability to care for their children. Medieval communities developed systems where protective services were built into the very fabric of daily life. The foundation of these support networks was the multi-generational household structure that characterized most medieval families. Multiple generations living together provided extra hands for baby care during winter emergencies. But more importantly, it provided redundant knowledge systems that could function even when key family members were incapacitated by illness or exhaustion. If a mother became too sick to care for her baby, grandmothers were available with decades of winter survival experience. Grandmother knowledge was particularly crucial for winter baby survival techniques because these women had typically survived multiple harsh winters and raised multiple children under similar conditions. They carried institutional memory about which techniques worked and which didn't, which emergency measures could save babies and which were dangerous wastes of precious resources. This knowledge wasn't written down in books. It was stored in the minds of women who had earned it through years of life and death experience. Extended family networks could provide wet nurses in emergencies when mothers died or became too ill to nurse during winter months. These arrangements weren't just about convenience or preference. They were about immediate survival for babies who would otherwise starve. Family members who had recently given birth or who were still nursing older children could take on additional babies, sharing their milk resources to keep vulnerable infants alive during crisis periods. But perhaps most remarkable was how communities developed surveillance systems that ensured no family with babies was completely isolated during winter emergencies. Neighbors monitored each other for signs of distress, watching for houses where smoke stopped rising from chimneys, where families stopped appearing for community activities, or where the sounds of crying babies suggested problems that might require intervention. This community surveillance wasn't intrusive government monitoring. It was neighbor-to-neighbor awareness that developed naturally in communities where everyone understood that winter emergencies could strike any family without warning. People paid attention to each other because they knew that their own survival might someday depend on similar attention from their neighbors. It's like having a neighborhood watch system focused on survival rather than security. The monitoring systems were particularly important for detecting when mothers had died in winter childbirth, leaving newborns in the care of fathers who might have no knowledge of infant care or older children who were struggling to survive themselves. Community members would notice when normal patterns of household activity changed, and they would investigate to determine whether intervention was needed to save vulnerable babies. Shared resource systems supported families with newborns during harsh weather by pooling community resources in ways that could mean the difference between survival and death. When one family's firewood supply ran dangerously low, neighbors might contribute fuel specifically to support households with babies who were most vulnerable to cold exposure. When food became scarce, families with slightly better resources would share with neighbors whose babies were struggling with malnutrition. Village cooperation in winter fuel gathering was often organized specifically around households with babies who needed extra heating resources. Community members understood that babies required more consistent warmth than adults, and they would prioritize fuel distribution to ensure that families with infants had adequate heating supplies. This wasn't charity, it was community investment in the survival of the next generation. Community midwife networks provided backup assistance during difficult births and postnatal emergencies. When one midwife couldn't reach a laboring mother because of weather conditions, other experienced women in the community would step in to provide whatever assistance they could. These backup systems ensured that some level of skilled help was usually available even during the worst winter conditions. The rotation of childcare responsibilities meant that even families with limited resources could provide adequate supervision for babies during winter months. Older children as young as 4 or 5 were expected to help with infant siblings, but this wasn't just about freeing up adult time. It was about ensuring that multiple people in each household understood basic baby care techniques and could provide emergency assistance when primary caregivers were unavailable. Traditional knowledge passed from older women to new mothers represented a crucial educational system that operated outside any formal institutions. Experienced mothers would teach new mothers about winter survival techniques through hands-on demonstration and shared experience. This knowledge transfer often happened during community gatherings or shared work activities, ensuring that survival skills were continuously passed down through generations. Social pressure ensured community care for orphaned or abandoned winter babies. By creating expectations that community members would step in when biological families couldn't provide adequate care. Families who failed to help with orphaned babies faced social consequences that could affect their own access to community support during future emergencies. This social enforcement meant that abandoned babies were more likely to find alternative care within their communities. The sanctuary and support systems for unmarried mothers and abandoned infants during winter operated through both religious and community channels. Monasteries provided some level of care for abandoned children, but communities also developed informal fostering systems where families would take in babies whose mothers had died, or whose families couldn't provide adequate care during harsh winter conditions. Religious feast days and community celebrations included special provisions for families with newborns, ensuring that winter babies received extra attention and resources during community gatherings. These events served multiple functions. They provided extra nutrition for nursing mothers. They allowed community members to assess the health and welfare of new babies, and they reinforced the social bonds that made community support systems function effectively. Church community aid included both spiritual and material support for families struggling with winter baby care. Priests didn't just provide religious comfort, they often coordinated community assistance efforts, and helped identify families that needed extra support. Religious institutions served as information centers where community members could learn about families in crisis and organize appropriate responses. The integration of spiritual and practical support meant that religious activities often served as organizing centers for community assistance efforts. Church gatherings provided opportunities for community members to coordinate resource sharing, plan assistance for struggling families, and ensure that no baby was forgotten or neglected during the most dangerous months of the year. Community grief and support systems helped families cope with the emotional devastation of losing babies to winter conditions, while also learning from these tragedies to improve survival strategies for future winters. When families lost children, communities would provide both immediate comfort and practical assistance, helping surviving family members process their grief while continuing to care for other children who still needed protection. The evidence of genuine affection and attachment, despite high mortality rates, reveals that these community support systems weren't just about survival statistics. They were about preserving the emotional bonds that made survival worthwhile. Communities understood that helping families maintain their humanity and emotional connections was just as important as providing material assistance for physical survival. But even the most sophisticated community networks couldn't prevent every tragedy or solve every emergency. There were situations where resources were simply insufficient, where weather conditions prevented any intervention, or where the accumulated stresses of harsh winters overwhelmed even the most dedicated community efforts. These failures led to some of the most heartbreaking decisions that medieval families ever had to face. The community networks that developed around winter baby survival represent some of the most sophisticated social support systems in human history. They operated without central coordination, government funding, or official procedures. Yet they managed to mobilize resources and expertise with remarkable efficiency during life and death emergencies. Understanding these systems reveals how much medieval communities valued their children and how far they were willing to go to protect the most vulnerable members of their society. But community support could only go so far when faced with the brutal realities of medieval winter conditions. When everything else failed, when all the knowledge and preparation and community assistance proved insufficient, families faced decisions that no parent should ever have to make. Consider what happened when a medieval family had exhausted every strategy, every resource, and every community connection, yet their baby was still dying. The herbal medicines had proven ineffective against pneumonia that wouldn't break. The heating techniques couldn't generate enough warmth to keep tiny bodies from losing the battle against hypothermia. The feeding strategies had failed as the mother's malnourished body could no longer produce milk, and no wet nurse could be found within traveling distance. This wasn't about parents giving up or failing to care adequately for their children. This was about reaching the absolute limits of what was possible within the constraints of medieval technology, resources, and knowledge. Modern parents might struggle to understand how loving, dedicated mothers could face situations where their best efforts simply weren't enough. But medieval winter created scenarios where human love and determination collided with physical realities that couldn't be overcome. Winter resource scarcity increased the likelihood of infant abandonment, not because parents loved their children less, but because families were forced to make impossible calculations about their survival prospects. When food stores were completely depleted, when fuel supplies couldn't stretch to cover the needs of the entire household, when illness had incapacitated the primary breadwinners, families faced mathematical realities that had no good solutions. The economic calculations that families had to make about winter baby survival prospects were heartbreaking in their stark simplicity. Could the family's remaining resources support everyone through the winter? Or would attempting to keep everyone alive result in the death of all family members? Could they afford to continue paying for a wet nurse when that money might be needed to buy food for older children who had better survival chances? These weren't abstract moral dilemmas. They were immediate survival decisions with consequences that would be known within weeks. Community monitoring became crucial when mothers died in winter childbirth, leaving newborns in the care of fathers who had no knowledge of infant care or older children who were struggling to survive themselves. Neighbors would watch for signs that motherless babies were failing to thrive, and they would step in when they could. But sometimes intervention came too late, or resources were simply insufficient to save babies who had lost their primary caregivers. The recognition of when herbal remedies and heating strategies proved insufficient required a level of medical assessment that was devastating for parents to perform. Mothers had to acknowledge when their babies were beyond the help that traditional treatments could provide, and they had to decide whether to continue exhausting family resources on attempts that were unlikely to succeed. These assessments required them to essentially give up hope while still caring for children they loved desperately. Extended family assessment of their ability to support additional babies during winter emergencies often led to difficult decisions about which children could be saved and which couldn't. When multiple family members were struggling with illness or resource shortages, taking in an additional baby might doom existing children who were already vulnerable. Extended families had to weigh their moral obligations against their practical limitations, knowing that overextending themselves could result in losing everyone. Churches and monasteries' willingness to take in abandoned infants during winter emergencies provided some hope for families facing impossible choices. But this option wasn't always available or accessible. Distance, weather conditions, and the limited capacity of religious institutions meant that abandoning a baby to church care wasn't a guarantee of survival, just a desperate attempt to provide chances that the family couldn't offer. Extended family networks could sometimes provide temporary or permanent care for babies whose immediate families couldn't survive winter challenges. But these arrangements required relatives who had sufficient resources and willingness to take on additional dependence. During harsh winters when everyone was struggling, finding family members who could take in additional babies became increasingly difficult. Wet nurse arrangements that pushed families into debt represented desperate survival measures that could mortgage a family's future against the hope of keeping a baby alive through one winter. Families would trade away their future economic security, their land holdings, or their possessions to pay for nursing services, knowing that this choice might leave them unable to survive future emergencies, but unable to watch their babies starve. Community foster care systems for babies whose families couldn't survive winter developed as informal networks where community members would take in children whose parents had died or become incapacitated. These systems worked when communities had sufficient resources and when enough families were stable enough to take on additional dependents. But during the harshest winters, entire communities might be stretched beyond their capacity to provide foster care. Religious institutions provided sanctuary for unmarried mothers and their babies, recognizing that single mothers had even fewer resources for winter baby survival than married couples. Monasteries and convents would take in mothers and babies when possible, but their capacity was limited, and their resources were also stretched during difficult winters. For many unmarried mothers, religious sanctuary was their only option for keeping their babies alive. Appeals to wealthier community members for emergency assistance with baby care sometimes provided life-saving resources. But these appeals required swallowing pride and acknowledging dependency in ways that were psychologically difficult for families who had previously been self-sufficient. Wealthy families had to balance their charitable impulses against their own survival needs and their obligations to their immediate families. Village collective action could sometimes mobilize resources when individual families could no longer cope with winter baby emergencies. But these efforts required community organization and leadership that weren't always available during crisis periods. Villages where leadership had been decimated by illness, or where resources were universally depleted, couldn't always mount effective collective responses to individual family crises. Religious community intervention in cases of potential infant abandonment provided both practical assistance and spiritual guidance for families facing impossible choices. Priests would counsel families about their moral obligations, while also helping to organize community resources that might make abandonment unnecessary. This intervention could be effective when resources were available and community cooperation was strong. But the historical record makes clear that infanticide was not a common response to winter emergencies. Infanticide was rare and condemned by both religious and secular authorities. When it did occur, it was typically prosecuted as a serious crime. The evidence suggests that medieval families went to extraordinary lengths to avoid infanticide, preferring abandonment or seeking community assistance rather than deliberately killing children they couldn't support. Accounts of devastated mothers being counseled by priests after losing babies reveal the depth of parental attachment and grief that characterized medieval families. These weren't people who had hardened their hearts against loss or who viewed children as disposable resources. They were parents who grieved deeply for lost children and who needed spiritual counseling to cope with tragedies that were beyond their control. Some mothers were recorded as going insane with grief after infant death, showing the emotional devastation that baby loss could cause even in societies where high infant mortality was expected. The depth of this grief demonstrates that high mortality rates didn't diminish parental attachment or make baby deaths easier to accept. Just because their living conditions were so much harsher doesn't mean they loved their children any less than modern parents, which made the losses even more heartbreaking. Community grief and support systems helped families process the emotional devastation of losing babies, while also learning from these tragedies to improve survival strategies for future winters. Communities would gather to mourn lost children, provide comfort to bereaved families, and analyze what had gone wrong to prevent similar tragedies from occurring again. Evidence of genuine affection and attachment, despite high mortality rates, appears throughout medieval records, contradicting modern assumptions that high infant mortality led to emotional detachment. Parents invested deeply in their children's welfare, developed strong emotional bonds, and grieved profoundly when their efforts to save their babies proved insufficient. The failure of all available strategies didn't represent parental inadequacy or lack of caring. It represented the collision between unlimited parental love and the limited resources and knowledge available in medieval society. Parents would exhaust themselves physically, emotionally, and economically trying to save babies who were beyond the help that their world could provide. Understanding these desperate measures and last resorts reveals how far medieval families were willing to go to protect their children, even when success seemed impossible. The lengths they went to, the sacrifices they made, and the grief they endured when their efforts failed demonstrate that parental love was just as powerful in medieval times as it is today, even when the tools available for expressing that love were tragically inadequate. But even when everything seemed to fail, when local resources were exhausted and community support wasn't sufficient, there were still variations in how different regions and communities approached these impossible challenges. Geography, climate, and cultural differences created different survival strategies and different outcomes across the medieval world. Here's what life looked like when winter meant something completely different depending on where you happened to be born. A baby entering the world in northern Scandinavia faced months of brutal cold that would kill a Mediterranean infant within days. Yet Scandinavian communities had developed survival strategies that were so sophisticated they could keep babies alive in conditions that would impress Inuit mothers. Meanwhile, a baby born in southern Italy might face what the locals considered a harsh winter that was still warmer than a typical spring day in Norway. These regional variations in winter survival weren't just about different weather conditions. They represented completely different approaches to the fundamental challenges of keeping babies alive during cold months. Communities that had lived with extreme cold for generations had developed technologies, techniques, and cultural practices that were entirely unknown to communities in milder climates. The result was a patchwork of survival strategies across medieval Europe that reveals how adaptable and innovative human societies could be when facing life-or-death challenges. Scandinavian communities were far more accustomed to extended cold temperatures that would be considered emergency conditions in other parts of Europe. For these northern peoples, what southern Europeans might consider a catastrophic winter was simply another seasonal cycle that required preparation and adaptation, but didn't represent an existential threat. This familiarity with extreme cold gave Scandinavian babies significant survival advantages when winter conditions were particularly brutal. Northern Europeans had developed superior experience with cold weather coping mechanisms that had been refined over centuries of harsh winter survival. Their techniques for maintaining warmth, preserving food through long cold seasons, and organizing community resources for winter survival represented some of the most advanced survival technologies available in the medieval world. These weren't desperate improvisations. They were sophisticated systems that had been tested and improved over generations. The specialized compact housing designed for heat retention in northern regions represented architectural innovations that were specifically adapted to extreme cold conditions. Northern European homes were built with thick walls, minimal windows, and interior layouts that maximized heat efficiency while minimizing heat loss. These design principles were completely different from housing in southern regions, where ventilation and cooling were often more important than heat retention. Advanced winter clothing technology in northern regions included sophisticated use of animal pelts and layering systems that provided insulation levels that were impossible to achieve with the materials available in warmer climates. Northern Europeans had access to furs from Arctic animals that provided superior warmth, and they had developed tanning and preparation techniques that maximized the insulating properties of these materials. The understanding of ice preservation and winter food storage in cold climates gave northern communities significant advantages in maintaining nutrition during extended cold periods. They could use natural freezing to preserve foods for months, and they understood how to manage ice storage systems that could keep food fresh throughout the winter. These techniques were largely useless in milder climates where natural freezing wasn't reliable. Mediterranean communities, by contrast, were less prepared for harsh winter, whether that was outside their normal experience. When unusual cold periods struck southern Europe, communities that were adapted to mild winters could face catastrophic mortality rates because they lacked the technologies and knowledge needed to cope with extreme conditions. Their housing, clothing, and food storage systems were optimized for different challenges. Italian chronicles show significant struggle with unusual cold periods that would have been manageable for northern communities, but represented unprecedented challenges for Mediterranean peoples. These records reveal how unprepared southern communities could be when faced with weather conditions that exceeded their normal experience and challenged their traditional survival strategies. Regional variations in available winter heating fuels created dramatically different survival prospects for babies born in different areas. Communities near large forests had access to abundant firewood, while communities in areas with sparse vegetation had to rely on alternative fuels like dried animal dung, peat, or even burning furniture and clothing during emergencies. The availability of quality fuel could determine whether babies survived or died during the coldest months. Different herbal knowledge based on local plant availability during winter months meant that communities had access to completely different medical treatments for infant winter illnesses. Northern communities might have access to pine needle preparations that provided vitamin C during winter months, while southern communities might have access to Mediterranean herbs that were unknown in colder climates. This regional variation in medical resources could significantly affect infant survival rates. Cultural differences in winter preparation and baby survival planning reflected different philosophical approaches to managing seasonal challenges. Some communities emphasized individual family preparation and self-sufficiency, while others developed more communal approaches that pooled resources and shared responsibilities. These cultural differences could determine how effectively communities could mobilize resources during winter emergencies. Coastal communities used different winter baby survival strategies than inland areas because they had access to marine resources that could supplement winter food supplies. Fish could be caught throughout much of the winter, and seaweed could provide nutrients that weren't available from terrestrial sources. However, coastal communities also faced unique challenges from winter storms and salt air that could complicate baby care. Mountain regions developed specialized high-altitude infant winter survival techniques that addressed the unique challenges of extreme elevation, including lower oxygen levels, more intense cold, and isolation that could prevent access to outside assistance. Mountain communities had to be entirely self-sufficient during winter months, which led to the development of particularly sophisticated resource management and baby care techniques. Regional craft specializations created different baby clothing and bedding materials that were adapted to local conditions and available resources. Communities with access to sheep developed different woolen goods than communities that relied on other animals. Communities near fur-bearing animals had access to materials that were unavailable elsewhere. These specializations meant that babies in different regions had access to completely different levels of protection from winter conditions. Local religious traditions affected specific winter baby protection rituals in ways that reflected regional cultural variations and available resources. Northern communities might have winter solstice traditions that provided community support during the darkest months, while southern communities might have different religious calendars that offered protection rituals at different times. These variations in spiritual support could affect both practical resource sharing and psychological coping during difficult periods. Urban versus rural differences in winter baby survival resource availability created significant variations in survival prospects within the same regions. Urban babies might have access to markets, medical practitioners, and diverse resources that were unavailable in rural areas. However, urban babies also faced challenges from crowded living conditions, pollution, and disease transmission that were less problematic in rural settings. The trade networks that connected different regions meant that some communities had access to resources and knowledge from distant areas that could improve winter baby survival prospects. Communities along major trade routes might have access to imported foods, medicines, or materials that could supplement local resources. However, these trade advantages were often disrupted during harsh winters when transportation became impossible. Today, we think of regional differences mainly in terms of cultural preferences or economic opportunities. We can live in Alaska and eat fresh fruit from California, or live in Florida and use heating oil from Canada. Medieval families were completely dependent on whatever resources were naturally available in their immediate geographic area, which meant that the accident of birth location could determine survival prospects in ways that are difficult for modern people to comprehend. The regional knowledge systems that developed around winter baby survival were often closely guarded secrets that communities were reluctant to share with outsiders. Successful survival techniques represented competitive advantages that could mean the difference between community survival and community extinction during particularly harsh winters. This secrecy meant that innovations developed in one region might never spread to other areas that could benefit from them. But despite all these regional variations, despite the different technologies and techniques and cultural approaches that characterized different areas of medieval Europe, there were common threads that connected all communities struggling with winter baby survival. Everywhere, mothers faced the same fundamental challenges of keeping their children warm, fed, and healthy during the most dangerous season of the year. Understanding these regional differences reveals both the diversity and the universality of medieval winter baby survival strategies. While the specific techniques varied dramatically based on local conditions and available resources, the underlying commitment to protecting vulnerable infants was consistent across all regions and cultures. Whether they were Scandinavian mothers using Arctic survival techniques or Mediterranean mothers adapting to unusual cold, the dedication to keeping babies alive represented a universal human response to the challenge of winter survival. These regional variations also demonstrate how innovative and adaptable medieval communities could be when facing life-or-death challenges. Rather than being passive victims of harsh conditions, these communities developed sophisticated technologies and strategies that were specifically adapted to their local environments. The diversity of solutions they created reveals the ingenuity and determination that characterized medieval approaches to the fundamental challenge of protecting the next generation. So here we are, having witnessed the extraordinary lengths that medieval mothers went to protect their babies through the deadliest season. These weren't primitive people stumbling through dark ages. They were innovators who developed sophisticated survival networks using nothing but heated stones, herbal knowledge, community bonds, and fierce maternal love. The high mortality rates did not represent failures of care, but the staggering harshness of medieval reality. What's remarkable is that so many did survive, shepherded through winter's darkness by mothers whose love burned steadier than their fires and proved stronger than the cold itself. Thank you for joining me on this gentle journey through the stranger corners of history. Until we meet again in another time and place, may your own challenges seem smaller when measured against the quiet heroism of mothers who fought winter with nothing but determination. And may you find comfort in knowing that human love has always been powerful enough to create light in the darkest seasons.